This week, Adrian Sanabria and Josh Bressers join us for a topic segment where we will tackle the topic: do we need penetration testing and vulnerability scanning? Then, in the security news, Zixil NAS devices are under attack, and the exploit is actually pretty simple: a new UEFI vulnerability with a name that some people don't like. That time you set up a load balancer and forgot about it. I love it when there's a vulnerability in a Wi Fi driver. Polyfill is filling the internet with supply chain vulnerabilities. Open source doesn't mean more secure. What happens when there is a vulnerability in your bootloader? The Red Hat Linux kernel model is broken. When disclosure goes wrong, and more IoT router vulnerabilities. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Breachlock is a global leader in continuous attack surface discovery and penetration testing. Since Breachlock was founded, they are adding over 50 new customers every month. They have discovered over 1 million reported vulnerabilities and performed more than 20,000 pen testing engagements, including pen tests for over 15,000 web applications, 8,000 mobile apps, more than 100,000 APIs, over 10,000 cloud security audits, and over 200,000 network endpoints. They test your entire attack surface and help you mitigate your next cyber breach before it occurs. Know your risk. Contact Breachlock today. Visit securityweekly.com/Breachlock. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself. This is Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 833, being recorded on Wednesday, June 26th, 2024. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Jeff Mann. Jeff, welcome.
Great to be here, Paul. Sorry I missed last week, but, day job activities took precedence.
Miss Mandy Logan is also here with us. Mandy, welcome.
Why, thank you so much. I'm going to rename my dog the Plank, so you can say I'm always walking the plank.
That's right. There you go. Very nice. I was waiting for the pirate joke. That's great.
For the listeners, I'm wearing my eye patch, and I have the DEF CON flag behind me. So
There you go. There you go.
Our-
We've got some other characters joining after, but quick announcement, and then we'll dive into it. Make sure you stay up to date with Security Weekly on X, formerly known as Twitter, for the latest show clips and updates. Find them at Sec Weekly and stay connected with the cybersecurity community. Today, I'm excited to have with us another Security Weekly host and good friend, Mr. Adrian Sanabria.
Hey there, 833 episodes? Is that it?
Yes.
That's all. A lot of episodes.
We started early, and we kept
we got some similar colors going on in our backgrounds.
We do. Well, I'll have a lighting discussion maybe with you after, but yeah. I need a DMX lighting expert to do a Vulcan mind meld with me. Mr. Josh Bressers is here with us. Josh, welcome back to Security Weekly.
Thank you, sir. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, see, we told you we'd bring you back.
I know, right?
And then we did. But we had a last-minute cancellation. No harm, no foul. Like, it happens. We talk about in podcasting, like it happens. The show must go on, and Josh and Adrian were kind enough to join us. And we kind of made up the topic as we went along. And I guess last-minute topics tend to be like what's on our mind. One of the things I've been thinking about lately,
but Paul,
which is interesting
before you jump into it, I mean, to be fair to our canceled host who was out on the notes, he had a little family emergency. It wasn't he just blew us off.
Yeah.
So
like I said, no harm, no foul.
We'll have him back soon.
Totally understand, and absolutely, we're going to bring him back, bring him on the show in a future episode for sure. So having worked in vulnerability management, right, and now not working necessarily in vulnerability management, I'm kind of like, do people still need a vulnerability scanner? And then, like, do you need a penetration test? And I'm not saying fire all your penetration testers and ditch your vulnerability management solution. That's not what I'm saying. I want to just debate the merits of them, because I think in certain circumstances, maybe a lot of circumstances, maybe you don't need that. Maybe we need to evolve. Maybe it needs to do something different than it did before, scratch a different itch, solve a different problem or challenge other than you've got an operating system and it's out of date on patches.
Or
Right?
maybe, Paul, both of those items, vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, should actually be done the way they were intended to be done back in the very beginning, and not co-opted by, I'm assuming you said you worked vulnerability management because you used to work for Tenable. And
Correct.
I would argue that vulnerability scanning and what Tenable offers isn't by definition vulnerability management. But let's take it from there and see where the conversation goes.
Yeah.
Wait,
I want to go ahead, Mandy.
I have a question because I want to qualify Paul's question. When you started questioning this, was it before LLMs became more popular, before generative AI started taking over some offensive security?
Yes, and I think that when I started questioning it was when Adrian and I worked on a project at CRA to evaluate vulnerability scanners and vulnerability management.
And what timeline is that?
When was that, Adrian?
2021.
I was going to say that was probably
2021.
4 years ago.
So it's not something I've talked about publicly until now. I want to give the floor to Mr. Josh Bressers because he is the guest, so to speak. I mean,
Sure. Yeah.
Adrian's in the Security Weekly family, so I'm going to give the floor.
That's proper courtesy.
Yeah,
Awesome.
you offer your drink, your guest a drink, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah,
Exactly.
Josh, have some bourbon.
Yeah. I will.
Oh, nice. There you go.
So I have a whiskey actually. I live in Wisconsin, and there's a small distillery in Madison that makes a whiskey from sorghum, which is some sort of grain I've never heard of before buying this, but it's quite
sorghum wheat, right?
Yeah, they make beer with it too. Yeah,
probably. I don't know. People make stuff with everything. It's great. Anyway. Okay, so I work for a company that does vulnerability management, right? That's kind of part of what we do. And I've been on the receiving end of many, many pen tests over the years. And I think in all my many years of experience, kind of in this whole universe, I agree with what Jeff said at the beginning about using them as intended. Because I think what we often do is we run these tools, we get these pen tests, we look at these reports, and we become hung up on individual details versus looking bigger picture. I think at some of this, and I think vulnerabilities are a great one, where there's this obsession with like zero vulnerabilities. I want a perfectly clean scan, and that's absurd, I think, in many instances. And additionally, if you're chasing like individual vulnerabilities, you're probably missing something bigger, which is like, do you have a patch management system? Are you patching anything? Are you just running a vulnerability scanner and then going off and chasing each vulnerability individually? So I think, I know your question is kind of loaded and a bit of a hot take, Paul, but I do think we do a lot of this stuff wrong because I think we treat pen tests and vulnerability management and scanning and that whole universe as if it was like 2005.
Yeah, like a very reactionary thing. Like, I'm going to scan my systems and then they're going to find vulnerabilities and missing patches, and then I'm going to go apply those. I think. So here's the thing. Today, you've got a Windows environment. Most companies today, they run on Windows, they run on Active Directory, Azure AD, or whatever Microsoft calls it now. But let's go back 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. The facilities to manage, monitor, maintain, and patch your Windows systems were not as good as they are today. I'm pretty sure most of us would agree on that fact. So I think today, let's just use Windows first as an example. If I've got a Windows environment and I'm director of IT security or director of IT or whatever in a management position, I'm going to be like, do we need like a bunch of third party tools and stuff to tell me that I'm missing patches? That this environment should already tell me like, hey, you're missing patches. Like, hey, it's Patch Tuesday. Time to go apply those patches and help me do vulnerability management on those systems. Now, pen testing isn't yet part of this, but let's just go with the Windows vulnerability management. Do I need some third party, open source or commercial, whatever it may be, to look at my Windows environment and tell me that I'm missing patches? I don't.
Well,
I
Paul,
don't buy
if
it.
I may, to unpack all of our opening statements a little bit further, I think to make a pointed statement, what is often done wrong with vulnerability scanning and penetration testing is too many organizations that use these tools and technologies, or third parties, as it were, or internal teams, are doing it primarily for the purpose of vulnerability discovery. And I think
Mhm.
that's where we immediately go off the rails. And that's what I refer to as saying it's being used incorrectly. If you're an organization that relies on these types of technologies to discover technical vulnerabilities in your environment, and because there's more types of vulnerabilities than the technical ones, I think you're sort of missing the boat on what you're supposed to be doing to manage the security of your technology in your enterprise. Agree or disagree?
I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, I'd
So
agree with
so
that.
now ask your questions, Paul.
Well, I don't want to discount vulnerability management altogether. I want to highlight where I think it's really good. And I've also highlighted where I don't believe that you need a whole ton of capabilities from a vulnerability management platform. And that is, you got Windows systems and like you need to manage the patches on them. Where
Right.
I think it shines is largely in the configuration management, right? I want to make sure that all of my Windows systems, and maybe I've broken that out into multiple different, categories. These Windows systems over here, those servers over there, workstations here, they need to adhere to some configuration standard. And the configuration management, I think, is crucial. I don't believe you get that from within the operating system itself. I think you need to rely on a third party tool to do configuration management, and that's where I really think it shines.
I would agree with that. And so I need to further clarify, because we're going to beat around the bush, but I might as well just throw it out there right at the outset. Um, PCI requires vulnerability scanning, requires penetration testing, also requires vulnerability management. But in a PCI context, um, vulnerability management accounts for two requirements. One requirement that is historically been involved with antivirus detection and protection. Now that's evolved to anti malware primarily. But I would summarize it as saying detecting things that show up on your systems that nobody intended for them to be there. And, we could argue what are the best ways to discover those things, but, call it what it is. Anti malware protection. That's one half of one of the two requirements. Requirement 5. The other requirement 6 is smack in the middle of patch management. But PCI describes what they're looking for in vulnerability management is having systems and processes in place to discover vulnerabilities that become public. And specifically, patches are supposed to be installed for any critical security vulnerability and patch that's provided or made available within 30 days of release of the fix, the patch. Part of requirement 6 also has to do with change management. So you're keeping track of all the things, testing your patches in the lab, making sure it doesn't break things, having backup procedures, and so on and so forth. That's the essence of vulnerability management. That's 5 and 6. Penetration testing and vulnerability scanning show up way down the ladder in PCI and requirement 11, which is the section that talks about monitoring and detecting your environment to keep things, make sure things are staying safe, and you're detecting any anomalous behavior, any potential attacks and things like that. So all of this discussion, at least for me, is going to be within a framework of vulnerability management is absolutely necessary and required, but has nothing to do with vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. That's something completely different. So,
I get you. There's a big
okay.
difference between scanning and management. Yeah,
Yep.
for sure. And I think that you could do a lot of this on your own with native tools, even the configuration management. I think if you
Mm-hmm.
got someone really good with Windows and or Linux, you could roll that in using built-in and or open source tools. But boy, is that a lot of work, and boy, scaling that is hard. You're almost creating your own product at that point, right? And I think that's what some of what gave birth to the vulnerability management scanning kind of sector, right? Is yeah, we could do this ourselves, but it's a lot of work.
Well, I also
I mean,
think
it's
that
that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
I was gonna say it's that the perpetual buy versus build
Mm.
situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like something I always see is you'll talk to a prospect. They're like, "Oh, we can do this with open source." And then they come back a year later and they're like, "Yeah, we started doing this and it's really hard." It's like, yes, it is.
Yes, yes. But on Linux systems too, like I was never a big in again a smaller Linux environment. I was kind of like I want to just apply the updates and make sure the updates are applied. I don't necessarily need to go scan for vulnerabilities. Like I know that there's vulnerabilities because I haven't run like a app update on them, right? And so I acquired. I'll give a plug to Automox, used to sponsor the show. That was a tool that I used to just make sure everything was up to date. I'm like, I don't need a whole scanning system and go find vulnerabilities. I just make sure all my Linux systems are up to date. And I want a tool, and this has been the big debate in vulnerability management, right? I want a tool that checks things is why people would buy a VM solution, right? But I also want something that's going to apply the patches. And I'm like, I just want to be really good at applying the patches, and I want a tool that's going to help me with that. Again, but I think at scale that may change the conversation. Adrian, what are your thoughts on where vulnerability management and scanning kind of plays in various organizations today?
Yeah, so I think each of these, both penetration testing and vulnerability management, have different use cases. So Jeff described one of them, basically measuring and validating the effectiveness of your IT operations, specifically patching in this case.
Mhm.
Is it actually getting done? Are people doing it? With what frequency? Are things missing? And to some extent, yeah, that extends to configuration management. We're not just talking about exploitable vulnerabilities here. This now extends to open S3 buckets, things in the cloud,
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of stuff. Anything an attacker could use to, that creates risk. Could be an attacker, could be accidental, just exposure of data. But with vulnerability management specifically, I think there's two use cases here that we have to kind of separate out and make peace with to understand. So, if you're looking to measure and validate the efficacy of your patch management program, it works fine for that, and also works well for spotting gaps. Things that you've missed, maybe systems that aren't getting updated. But if you're using it to get in front of threats and exploits against those systems, I don't think it works as well.
No,
Because
it's a
then
great point. That's a great. I think that's exactly what I was driving at, Adrian. Yeah, yeah.
that's a race against attackers. If you think about how a vulnerability management or how a network, say a network vulnerability scanner works, because this is distinct from like an application vulnerability scanner.
Mm-hmm.
So in the AppSec world, if we're talking web apps, APIs, stuff like that, you're looking to discover new exploits, new vulnerabilities for the first time, right? Maybe it's code that your company wrote, but with other vulnerabilities that actually get published, that get a CVE, there's a bit of a race there where everybody finds out at the same time that a vulnerability has been disclosed. And maybe people knew before it was publicly disclosed about this thing. Maybe they already wrote an exploit. We don't know, right? But Tenable is finding out the same time that anybody else can find out, because they're all finding out either from the vendor or from the full disclosure mailing list, or there's a number of different ways we can find out about it. So that's where the clock starts, right? And if you're managing a vulnerability scanner, you've got to analyze it. You've got to figure out how to write a check. That check has to go through QA. Then eventually it gets rolled out to the scanner. Maybe this can all be done in a couple of hours in a day. I don't know how fast that happens.
It varies.
But
When you
you know
said
that
write a check, Adrian, I thought purchase something. But
yeah,
sorry, I'm old.
right. So yeah, Tenable calls them plugins. Some
Yeah.
kind of determining if you've got the vulnerability on your systems. The little piece of code that does that, or it reaches out and says, "Yeah, you're missing this patch, or you've
I
misconfigured this thing."
I would break that into a couple pieces as well. I mean, there's the way Tenable works, right, where they're kind of
Sure.
sitting somewhere away and they
I might be
check.
getting to where you're going though.
Like if you're a developer, right, and you're using, let's say you have an npm project, like you can figure out what's in that, right? You got your package.json file and your package
Yeah,
log.
so I think I was going where you're going.
Okay,
So
good.
if you let me finish the thought, maybe I'll get there. But yeah,
Maybe,
so
maybe.
this kind of traditional way of my scan tells me if I'm vulnerable to something, to make that long story short, yeah, it's going to come down to your tool, and then whenever your next scheduled scan is, it's going to run. Then a human needs to lay eyes on it and analyze it and decide whether or not they're going to do something about it. Right? They're going to poke the IT people and say, "Hey, we're missing this patch." Maybe raise an emergency, something like that. By that time, days have taken place. And you could have found out the same way that your vulnerability scanning company found out and started working on it back then, right? So there are tools in the market where you can check the box for, I don't know, Apache or Nginx or whatever software you already know is in your environment. And you can react to that in real time. You already know you've got that software in your environment. So waiting on the scan is just, that's bleeding away time that you could be responding to this thing, mitigating it. Maybe if a patch isn't available yet, if you understand the vulnerability, you can put a mitigation in place. Like Log4j, the big thing is if you're doing outbound filtering, if you're not letting your servers talk to anywhere on the internet, you probably weren't really worried about Log4j exploits. So sure, the exploit would work, but there's nowhere for it to return to because you're blocking that stuff outbound. So there's mitigations you can do as well. But I don't know if that's where you were going, Josh. But yeah,
Kind of.
I don't think the race works in our favor if we look at how quickly things are getting exploited in the wild from the point where they're publicly disclosed.
So I think there's some changes that have happened, I'd say, over the last couple of years in that regard. If you look at like the software bill of materials universe and how some of that is starting to work now, where you create your asset inventory essentially of whatever it is you're dealing with, be it an application or a system or an environment. Like Kubernetes clusters are one of my favorites, right? Where you could have like hundreds of things running. So keeping track
Yeah.
of that is obviously a nightmare. And so what happens now a lot of times is you've got your like software bill of materials or some sort of asset inventory, and then vulnerabilities are announced, and they'll oftentimes be, just kind of magically added where if there's correct data coming out of NVD or somewhere like that, then your vulnerability scanning system will automatically pick that up. And because you already have the inventory, you don't have to go scan for it again.
Mhm.
It's like, pow, we've got it. Like we've got alerts firing off literally minutes after something like Log4j goes public, which is pretty freaking cool.
Right. But then you have to consider, maybe my Barracuda mail gateway also has Log4j in it. You've got,
Yeah,
so
right,
like the
right.
DevOps world is kind of this, the how I see vulnerability management happen there looks very different than in like a traditional
For
flat
sure.
network, with a lot of legacy systems on it.
For
But
sure.
Yeah, I think
Josh is
I just
tripping
want to go back to
over.
your point. I just want to go back to Adrian's point for a moment that
Then me,
let's
Paul.
say I'm managing 10,000 Linux systems and there's an Nginx vulnerability. If I've got 10,000 Linux systems, I've got a pretty good patch management process. I can go update everything, right? And that's where I'm saying you don't necessarily need
Yeah.
a vulnerability scanner or external third party tools. I've got something that's going to go take care of that. I
Yeah.
think the
By the
use
time the security
case,
team's like, "Hey, there's a problem," the IT team
yeah,
is like, "Yeah, we patched it days ago. Where you
yeah,
been?"
exactly right. I'm not waiting for the scanners to update. Like I'm just like, oh, like the patch is out. I've got a system in place for that. I'm gonna go do that on all 10,000 systems or however much percentage of those are vulnerable to it, and I'm gonna call it a day. Where I think vulnerability scanning slash management comes in is detecting like where things fell down.
Yeah.
And I think this really
Yeah.
becomes a
Yeah.
scale problem because if I
Gaps. Yeah.
go, we all, I mean, all of us on the show and listening, right? We've all patched systems before, whether that's your personal system, you've got one system to manage, whether it's 100,000. We all know like stuff can go sideways when you patch
Mhm.
Mhm.
stuff. And the way I would position when I worked for Tenable and now is that that check, that like where did things go wrong? I thought I patched all 10,000 of my systems, but it turns out these three, it didn't work. And my tooling didn't pick up on that for whatever reason. And that happens because we're managing very complex environments and systems today. So I think that's more of the use case. But I do believe we need to change our mindset slightly and just move towards a patch first mentality. I even said this when I worked at Tenable. I mean, you can go back into the podcast archives. I said it back then. I'm like, just patch your systems. Like, don't
Yeah.
wait for
So,
us. And
so
when I worked
there's
at Tenable, I was like, don't wait for us to find it and then have a debate about it. I'm like, just patch it.
so there's
It's that
something
easy.
critical that changed in the industry here. And it's ransomware, right? Like at one point in time, anything that would cause downtime for your systems, people are like, no, we got to do test patches, we got to send it to test groups, stuff like that. And kind of after 5, 6, 7 years of companies getting hit with ransomware, they're saying, you know what? You know, I'll accept some downtime. You know, like
Yeah,
let's go ahead. You know, so that patch first mindset, I'm seeing more and more
That's good.
companies
Well,
and security leaders
but,
and
not
people
good that
they
ransomware
report
is being
to.
a try. Anyway, Jeff,
It's
you
not
have
good.
comments.
Well, I mean, Josh dropped in the concept of inventory, and then the use case that you were describing, Paul, of having 10,000 Linux servers. I wanted to focus on that for a moment. The other flaw in using vulnerability scanners in pen testing as vulnerability management, not only is the reliance on discovery of vulnerabilities, but also the reliance on discovery of systems in your network.
Yes.
Whereas what you're
I
describing,
know
Paul,
where
as
you're
the
going, yeah.
ideal is exactly
Asset discovery.
what PCI has been requiring since day one. Know what you have in your environment,
Right.
and one of the reasons why patch management's part of vulnerability management in requirements 6 is, you should know, because you're getting notices from, you get the Microsoft Patch Tuesday releases, but if you've got other operating systems, hopefully those vendors are giving announcements of, hey, we just found this problem, or you're monitoring social media news sources, listening to this podcast, and you're finding
And
out that there's a severe problem out there. Don't wait for the scan to happen to tell you that you have
right.
systems that have a problem and you need to fix it. You're supposed to know what systems you have. You're supposed to have an inventory, and you should be getting on it right away, because the clock starts as soon as the patch or the fix or the update is released
Yeah.
in terms
Oh,
of
but
fixing it.
I agree, Jeff, and I think it's a great point, because while some vulnerability management solutions do incorporate some level of asset management, right? But what you're saying is, if me as Paul, I'm managing 10,000 Linux systems, maybe I have 10,023,
Right.
and those
Yeah.
23 I don't know about, or someone put up and they're not in my process, and that's largely where I would position vulnerability management to go, well, we can find
Mhm.
those 23, because like
So
one of those 23 is probably going to be a huge problem if an attacker gains a foothold in it, right?
Right.
And we don't always know. Now, I would implore you to use tools and processes and techniques to make sure you understand and know about everything on your network, which is not an easy thing to do.
mhm.
But I'll mention another event. Run Zero is a great solution for that. There's a million open source ways to do that, right? Like all of us, like we've all kind of rolled together our own scripts for like discovering everything that's on the network, and it
Yeah.
uses Nmap or whatever, right? Like there's a million different ways to do that. You need to do that. You
So
need to do it well.
So
Well,
there's
you
a
know,
footnote I want to throw in there on. So vulnerability scanners are famously terrible at asset identification. Like
I
any tool
to a
can
large extent,
discover.
I agree, Adrian. Yeah, yeah.
So any tool can discover an asset. Like you see it sending out ARPs,
Mm-hmm.
you can ping it, you get responses. Like there's a lot of ways to discover an asset. But what is the asset? What's running on
Right.
that thing? Who manages it? Like all
Asset
that stuff
discovery
is
versus asset management is what you're talking about, right?
well
Similar to
at
scanning
no.
versus management.
or
So before
identification.
management, in between there, you've got asset identification. So if you run the three big, a lot of us have Ubiquity devices, right?
Yes.
So if you run Rapid7, Qualys, Tenable, and they see a Ubiquity device, they're
Oh, it's
going
a
to tell
Linux
you this is
box.
an
Yep.
out of date Debian server,
Yep.
right? Even though Ubiquity has a specific MAC address on there that's tied to the company, even though there's a special service that run on these
Let's be
devices,
fair, though. Most of the time, it is an outdated Debian system, because that's the
right?
operating system they use
They're
for the
not
distribution under
wrong.
the covers, right? They're not
Right.
usually
But then you
wrong.
run run zero, and run zero tells you this is a Ubiquity HD in wall access point
Right.
running this version of firmware, and it's this specific model number. because there's actually a service on these Ubiquity devices that will tell you exactly what it is, but nobody at the vulnerability management companies has taken the time to teach their systems, their scanners, how to talk to
But
that
also what's
service.
interesting in
But
that
Run Zero has.
in that example, Adrian, if you were to log into your Ubiquity management system, it would tell you exactly what you have, what you currently are managing anyway, right?
If you know that you've got
if you know
Ubiquity,
that, right? But like
like if somebody just comes in and plugs it in, that's what
right,
I'm.
exactly. But
Yeah.
like if I'm managing my Ubiquity gear, I know I have 3 access points and I have a controller right here in the studio. When I log into Ubiquity, it goes, yeah, like
Yeah.
this is out of date, your controller's out of date, your management software's out of date, and your 3 access points need a firmware update. And that's only
But
because
then,
I log into it like once a year. It tells me
the
that. So.
the irritating thing is now your vulnerability management metrics are always going to be wrong because they're going to tell you, you've got all these out of date,
Right.
even if it's fully patched, it's going to tell you you've got out of date critical Linux servers, and you every single time somebody's going to ask something about that. Well, the reason it's saying
But
that is these are
this is the but
Ubiquity, and
this is actually a great point for vulnerability management solutions, because outside of Windows, Mac OS, and Linux as a desktop, server, laptop, or whatever, right? Everything else on your network, that's where they shine.
yeah.
Because you have a different management system for all those different devices, if you have one at all. So discovery, identification, and enumeration of what software it's running, whether it's out of date or not, is very critical for those devices. To me, that's where the vulnerability management solutions today, like the big 3, really shine. Is it and I call it the dusty corners, right?
So I have
Go
a
ahead,
fun
Josh.
anecdote for you from Run Zero. So the shirt I'm wearing, CypherCon, HD Moore was the keynote at CypherCon this year.
Nice.
And one of the things he said that like made my head explode is every time they go to any customer they have at Run Zero, they always say, how much stuff do you have? And they basically ask them, tell us what your inventory looks like for your environment. And he said, it doesn't matter how big the organization is, it's 10%. They find 10% more stuff than they think they have every single time. And I believe that 100%.
Dude, so it's funny you say
10%
that,
is a
because
lot.
I use the free version of Run Zero, and I go through the same thing, right? And this is why this management and discovery process is important. And I'll underscore the point by saying there's a consolidation happening here in the studio, and like a whole bunch of stuff came off the network, and I scanned it. I don't think it was with Run Zero or something else, and there was still 24 like live IP addresses on here, and I was like, that's probably 20% more than I could even count in my head. Even like, I'm like, all right, well, there's a couple of
Are they in the
firewalls, and like,
walls? Where
they're
are
like
they?
load balance. I'm like, that's technically 3 IP addresses. And I'm like, there's some access, but I'm like, there's still a lot more on the network than I thought there should be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it literally cut that number in half, and there's still more. And so now take that example and extrapolate it out to a large organization that has 50,000 or 100,000 devices. And
Yeah.
there's
Right.
10%
I mean,
is a
I've done
lot.
calls with organizations that are like, I know I'm doing a really good job at asset inventory and management and discovery, but like, I'm really worried about that 1%. And I'm like, yeah, that's the one that'll get you. And they're absolutely
And,
right. And it's
and
not
that's the
easy.
network you manage. Then you've got 10,000 SaaS apps that employees are using.
That's right.
And you can't
Yep.
scan those with a network scanner.
And 10,000 employees that are working from home.
Yeah.
That's right. I have another great anecdote on that. So, kind of poking at Jeff and PCI, when Log4Shell happened. So there's an open source scanner the company I work for, Anchor, has, called Sift. And Sift you just point it at like a directory full of crap, and it'll like tell you what's there. And you can imagine during Log4Shell, Sift became extremely popular for some reason. And there was someone from a large bank I was talking to, and they estimated it was going to take them 3 months to figure out where they had Log4j in their environment. Like 3 freaking months.
Yeah,
Holy
Log4Shell
cow.
or Log4j?
Log4Shell affected Log4j, right? That was the name of
Log4Shell was
Oh,
the
right.
name
Right,
of the
right.
vulnerability.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
exploit.
I'm waiting for the dig at PCI though, Josh.
Well, no, I'm just saying, PCI says you're supposed to know all this stuff, right? This is a bank.
But banks don't have to follow PCI.
Maybe it was out of scope.
Oh, right. I suppose that's true. Like, banks are special, aren't
Maybe
they?
it wasn't in the
They are
CDE.
special.
Okay. Lay off.
Banks are not required to be PCI compliant. period.
Yeah, typically, yeah. If they don't
That's like
have
the
hands,
security people who don't update their stuff, right?
they get to outsource that stuff, right?
Well, it's PCI sees two types of what they call entities: merchants and everybody that supports the merchants, which they
Acquires,
collectively call
yeah.
service
Ah,
providers. The acquiring banks, the issuing banks, you know, they have language that says, well, surely the banks will follow PCI. But the problem is they don't have to report their compliance to anyone. The card brands don't ask them for it. Their peers don't ask them for it. So do the math. If you don't have to report your compliance to anyone, that tells me you don't have to do it. And I've worked with banks that don't do it. They follow
But I,
it and they have, well, we're on the path to remediation. We're on the roadmap to get PCI compliant. Well, I'm like, that's great, but if you were one of these other entities, you'd be non-compliant and getting fined by yourselves, by the way.
here's what
Anyway,
I'm hearing so
nitpick.
far, and I think this kind of sums it up nicely so far, is that if you're doing like patch like systems management and patch management and asset discovery, that you should do that, and you should use tools and develop processes that let you do that really well.
Mm-hmm.
And you should not rely on a vulnerability scanner or management platform or a penetration test to tell you what you should already know. In that, I'm managing 10,000 Linux systems, I've got 50,000 Windows desktops, and those I know, those I patch. I know when there's a patch missing on them because I'm doing patch management. That's not what it's intended for. I think that's where we've really seen the evolution of IT management. Is I believe tools exist today that let you do asset management, vulnerability management super well without like a whole ton of third party tools that are scanning and finding stuff you didn't know about. I think there's this delineation,
I'll
right?
add 2
And
points to that, Paul. The
go
first
ahead,
one
Jeff.
being, if you're an organization like many organizations that haven't necessarily always embraced, doing security the right way and in the right order, by all means, run a scanner and find out what you're dealing with.
Yeah, agreed.
Um, the second point being, oh God, what was my second point? Um, Again, in PCI, the way the vulnerability scanner falling in the monitoring and detection part and the security stuff in requirement 11 is exactly what you're describing. Use it as I call it a safety net, because
Yeah.
everybody knows that nothing works 100%. You don't patch everything. In a retail context, when you know you're a merchant that has 1,000 locations all over the country, and the endpoints that you're scanning or hoping you're scanning are what we used to call cash registers, checkout lanes. You go to any store and they might have 12 checkout lanes. How many of them are being used at any given time? How many of them are actually even turned on? You know, People in the old days that had salespeople and people working from home that have laptops, not everything is always on and getting the patch when the patch
Hmm.
is being pushed out. There's always legitimate reasons why you miss stuff. So using the vulnerability scanner as a safety net to catch the things that were missed, or whatever the problem was, the patch didn't go as planned and didn't get
Yeah.
everywhere. Absolutely, that's what the
But
intention
shouldn't
of.
your patch management system tell you that? Like the next time that device checks in, it should go, yeah, you know what? That system's not up to date anymore.
It
Or
should
Well,
not
be,
up to date.
and they
to
often
double,
do.
to double down on what Jeff's saying, this is for the stuff that's not checking in, right?
Mhm.
This
Yeah.
is
Sure.
the
Yeah.
stuff that for some reason isn't part of that program. And running, I remember the first time I put a sim in place, we ran into this issue constantly. Like for whatever reason, when I got that sim, like there was no guidance out there. I was like, okay, we're gonna shove events and logs from everything we got into this thing. And before you knew it, we had 1,700 devices pushing stuff in there. And one day the Linux devices just stopped checking in, and it's because somebody blew away the syslog.conf, and it just observability went from 100% to 0% overnight on those things because they blew away the syslog.conf. And they, they didn't notice, and we had to go reach out to them, and stuff like that happens. So having some kind of sanity check, and
Yeah.
vulnerability scanners can be that sanity check to say, hey, like these have fallen off the wagon and nobody saw them roll off the back. but you definitely want to know about it, because on the IT side, you've got observability tools.
Mhm.
Like a lot of people often ask, like why isn't New Relic doing this stuff, right? Like why haven't they moved into the security space? Like there's a lot of tools out there that already have all this information. We're basically duplicating work that the IT teams have
Right.
already done to some extent.
Well, and
And that's what I want to
interestingly
advise
enough,
people to try and avoid in your environments. And as complex as our systems are, I think we need to, as much as we can, simplify the process of vulnerability identification and remediation.
and by simplify you mean automate most of the
Yeah,
time.
absolutely automate it. Yeah.
But interestingly, ironically, PCI 4.0, one of the new requirements that you've got a grace period until next April to actually put this in place. But not only is your intrusion detection and all your monitoring and logging and your SIM supposed to be reporting alerts, new requirement, you have to have some means of detecting, and I'm paraphrasing grossly, but you have to have some way of detecting when things stop reporting in, especially
Yes.
security control systems. Things that are doing things to
That's a great
protect
addition
your
to
CD.
PCI, Jeff. That's a great
Yeah.
addition to any security program,
Yep.
especially
Yeah.
PCI. Yeah.
Paul, if you were to put on Jeff's glasses, they would have the entirety of PCI 4.0 printed in very tiny text
Yes.
on the inside.
Right. It's very true. It's a little known fact. It's very true.
I mean,
Yeah.
so there's also the weird angle to all this, I think, which is kind of the AppSec piece, right? We've been very focused on infrastructure
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
running systems, but I think vulnerability scanning when you're dealing with like DevOps and developers is a whole different beast.
Totally
And I mean,
different
you could
animal.
talk for like
But
hours and hours
I
on
think
that.
I think that's largely, I don't know, I'm going to go on a limb and say I look at that as largely a solved problem. If
No.
I'm going to no, hold on. I'm going to add on to that with if you're adopting modern processes in technologies, right? Like there is so much technology that if you're creating software today to test that software, to do the dependency checks, to look at everything inside your software and automate processes to update things, largely the solutions exist. Not
The
everyone
solutions
is
exist.
right.
Doesn't mean
So that
everybody's
I mean
using them.
that's why like my utopia is it's a solved problem, but we're not
Well,
quite there yet because there's still a ton of legacy software
So
that's not implementing those tools and processes. But
How
like
about it's a
that to
solvable
me,
problem? We have the
it's
problem is
very much a
technology.
people.
solvable problem. It's
so
a
I
solvable
get
problem.
what you're saying, Paul. Like the pipelines, the development pipelines, like are known. Like if you're writing code and you're deploying code, like there's no mystery to it. You can put things in that pipeline. Like you
Yeah,
don't
there's
have
tons
the
of checks you can put in that entire pipeline,
yeah.
Adrian. That and we all like, right? We know the
You
tools, the
don't have
techniques, they
the
exist.
aquarium somebody puts on a casino network. That nobody notices or
If
something
I've
like
got a
that.
Docker container and it contains
Sure.
vulnerabilities, there's a laundry list of tools that right.
Yeah.
Anchor makes some of those, Josh. Right? There's a laundry list of
Yes.
tools. They can tell me and automate the process of going like your Docker container is out of date. And so, like to me, like you shouldn't have a vulnerable Docker container because like all the stuff you need to make sure that that's secure exists out there today.
Except what happens is
If
we
people don't do
say
it,
we're going to update our container every time we build our new version. And then one day it breaks and it's Friday afternoon. And
then
someone says,
then you're in a
we're
race
just
to
going to pin
yeah.
this container till Monday.
No, I know.
Then Monday
Yeah.
never
I'm
comes.
like,
Look at
I'm like, please
Microsoft.
don't do that. Like, don't do that though. Like, now I manage a much smaller software, piece of software than many. So, like, I had one 10,000 line Python project, right? And organizations have much larger projects and thousands of them. So scale is very different, right? But my approach was always exactly what you're describing: update to the container, and if something breaks you go fix it, right? And you fix it in real time. But scaling that out to thousands of apps that have hundreds of thousands or
Yeah.
millions of lines of code is a challenge, but I
Like-
think it is a solvable problem. You just got to be willing to put the right resources and effort and process in place to do that, and not everyone does that.
So
And
Yeah,
everyone's got legacy software, right? But like most people have legacy software that's not benefiting from this process yet because you haven't put it in the new process because it's
and you get
expensive.
you get into human problems too.
Oh
Like
yeah.
reading the Microsoft CSRB report, and yeah, they intended to deprecate that key, that signing key, but they just didn't. Because there was some
Yeah.
problem with a thing, and they're like, "We'll do it
Oh
later," and
god.
then
Like
nobody
signing
remembered
keys
it,
and
and they forgot
certificates
about
and,
it.
and stuff like that is a we could do a whole hour just on
Yeah,
that
and
for sure. Yeah.
things get messy.
Hey, I have an
I do want
opinion
to I do want
question
to
for you
touch
guys before you
oh,
before you move on, if I may,
yeah,
Paul,
Jeff and then Mandy. Yep.
because this is sort of playing off what Josh was bringing up about the lack of focus on AppSec. So, in Requirement 6 of PCI, I sort of glossed over and ignored the other part of Requirement 6, which historically has to do with secure software development. And if you're
Ooh,
doing something
the
that's
WAF one,
internet facing, for many years,
6.6.
yeah, well, old 6.6, the requirement was either do some sort of web application security testing or implement a WAF. In
And
version
everybody did the
4,
or.
Yeah, everyone just yeah.
well,
But
so in version 4, they've sort of changed their strategy, and I'm just curious, what do you guys think of what where they're going with it? Basically, in requirement 6 now, as of next April, there's this grace period. You gotta have a WAF, period. And they've ripped out the, again, this is future dated, the requirement for web application security testing, because they've already always required the penetration testing in requirement 11 to be network based and application level based. So people were asking for years, what's the difference? And I think at some point the lines were blurred. But the way things, future state as of next April, when version 4 is fully in force, from a vulnerability management perspective, they want you to have an SDLC. They want you to build security into every step of the design process, have coders that are well versed on secure application development. They even have a requirement that addresses SBOMs. You have to have it. You basically have to have an SBOM for any application you're using in your CDE, in your payment environment. But they're pushing off the any kind of application testing to basically the penetration testing. Curious as to what your guys' thoughts are, sort of that change in strategy from a PCI perspective.
I think largely you can automate the discovery of bugs and vulnerability in a modern SDLC.
Mm-hmm.
And I think until you've done that, you're not quite ready for a pen test, right? It goes back to like when you should use a pen test, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
the pen test is to, we all talk about AI and LLMs and automation, but nothing can really replace a really truly skilled tester and vulnerability researcher that can just go find the weird things
Right.
that could lead to a bad day. And like now, typically, those are chained vulnerabilities. And I,
Yeah.
I think this is a positive thing in our industry today, right? That the vulnerabilities that have the highest price tag are not just one vulnerability, but it's a chain of vulnerabilities and a chain
Right.
of exploits that
It's
get you
not
there.
admin.
Yeah, dude. Like it's a lot of work in, look at Chrome,
So I'm sure that still
in
happens.
even like a sandbox escape. Like there's a great interview on security cryptography, whatever, one of my favorite podcasts. It's right up there with open source security podcast, Josh. It's but they interviewed Mark Dowd and they talked about like exploits and vulnerabilities and the markets behind them, and how you can update something like Chrome and it can invalidate your exploit. But how does it do that, right? Like this stuff has gotten so much better from a defensive standpoint, and there's still people breaking it, which is the hacker spirit, and I love. But there's a lot of nuances there, and chaining vulnerabilities together is a thing that we haven't kind of weaved into our conversation, but I think it's pertinent to the discussion
Well, let me
because
restate the
that's
question. Are you guys all okay with absolutely requiring a WAF to protect your web-based applications at this point? Because PCI says you
eh.
gotta have a WAF.
WAFs are infinitely available. So I often use WAFs as a metaphor for protecting against jailbreaks with large language models.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because just the way that it works, there's always going to be some encoding, some kind of trick you can use to get around that WAF rule. So it requires somebody sitting behind the WAF, being reactive to it. And, to some extent, like, sure, put the WAF there, as long as it's not causing problems and breaking things, but I think we're at the point now where everybody's more focused on what happens when it fails.
Well, I
It's
mean,
really just another
because it's going to fail.
It's another link in the chain that an attacker would have to jump through.
right,
And
but
if it's not a high bar that they have to jump over,
If it
then
can prevent 60% of the attacks,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
it has value, right?
But to clarify, it's not taking the place of patch management, secure code development, doing tests of your code before you promote it to production. Having people that know, in theory, know what they're doing and do secure code development in the first place. It's not precluding any of that. It's simply now a requirement as opposed to, well, you can do a WAF or a web application test. The web application test is still a requirement. It's just now squarely in requirement 11 as part of the pen test, which is network and application level.
So Jeff,
type of
one of my
testing.
favorite things about WAFs that you can do with a WAF is patch isn't ready yet. This is a mitigation tool that you can
Yeah.
put in place to
Agreed.
buy you a day
Time.
or 2
Yep.
days. Buy you a little bit of time to get that code change done, get that deployed.
Well, I guess that's
Right,
part
I
of
have a
what I was getting
soapbox to
at
get on.
is a WAF a good stopgap mitigation, let's say, while you're getting caught up.
Yeah.
Soapbox.
Temporary
I wanna-
remediation. I agree with Adrian. Temporary remediation. Josh, you have a
Okay,
soapbox.
I have a soapbox, but before Mandy had a comment, I think, and
Yep.
I think
Yeah,
let's
Mandy.
give her a moment.
Oh, thank you. I had a couple questions, but one, Josh, based on something you had said earlier, I was curious, not on the total number of assets, but based on a company's size or their budgetary constraints. Is there a time where you think a specific size organization in general will still do better with vulnerability management than without it? Like a whole platform, or because we're talking about
Right.
vulnerability management is dead, pen testing is dead.
I mean, it's not dead; it's just pining for the fjord zone. No,
But
it's
I like your train of thought, Mandy, because I think there is, and I don't know if we could, put like a stake in the ground, and put like hard numbers around like number of systems, number of applications, kind of thing.
No.
But I do think like at scale, as your scale increases, so does your reliance on a vulnerability management platform
yeah.
to find those like weird use cases and stuff you don't know about, right? Like I think in a
I
smaller
almost
environment, you can get your arms around it and not require that. But like it's again like
Well, I was
I go
actually
from
thinking.
managing
I
like
would suggest that
one
it's
software
it's
application
an
to
inverse.
thousands.
It's an inverse relationship, Paul. I think because smaller organizations tend to not have the teams and the people that are dedicated to doing this kind of
True.
stuff that can
Right.
get
That's
their
also
arms
true.
around it. I think the smaller companies are much more reliant on any kind of automated tool that does anything, and the larger you get, the more likely that they are going to have the teams that could be doing it themselves, and the tools that are available are just an added layer of protection.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of this comes
Or
back to
complementary.
labor costs,
Right.
labor
But
costs, the
and
overhead
I
of
think what we're
using the
saying is
tool.
like make sure that your tools and processes are adding value to
Yeah.
your security programs, right?
Oh,
And I think what
God.
we laid out in the past roughly hour is
If you say
has to
ROI,
add
I'm going to
value.
reach out and smack you, Paul.
No, I did not say ROI.
What-
I
what-
said
what's
I
Mandy's?
said add value.
Let's hear another one of
I-
Mandy's questions.
Oh, thanks. Well, my other question actually, maybe it's a good way to end since Adrian, earlier on Slack, you had said that penetration tests were 99.9% information on patches that were missed. Like it's just all about patches, so penetration testing wasn't required. I was going to ask you to speak more on
Yeah,
that.
where'd you get that stat from? I think it's
From
kind of stinky. It's
He
kind of
made it up.
stinky. Is what I'm saying.
yeah, yeah, no, I made it up, but yeah, it's what everybody says. Like, oh, that's that kind of penetration test. That's not a good quality penetration test, but it's most of them. Like I've rarely read a pen test report that actually gets into root cause. and gets into, this is broken in operations because they do this way, and that's why the patch is missing. It's never that. It's just, this vulnerability was present, this patch was missing.
I'll
And
say this,
it's the
Adrian. 99.9% of the pen tests that I review for my PCI clients are really just vulnerability assessment reports.
Yeah.
yeah.
Period.
In that
And
context, for sure.
and it's the nature of the service, right? The
Mhm.
reason that none of these pen tests are the good pen tests is because it is a market that drives towards the cheapest product.
Yep.
And particularly if something just says you have to have a pen test, you have to check this box. Of course, people are going to pay for
Yeah.
the cheapest thing.
Yep.
And when you're
Mhm.
time constrained, you're not going to do a whole bunch of interviews to determine the root cause of why Eternal Blue is still hanging out on these 5 servers.
Yeah, I think a good pen test should not only tell you about stuff you don't know, but more so test your processes and response.
Yep.
Yeah,
And I
Yeah.
come
Absolutely.
back to, I frequently ask my pen tester friends, like, what's the most difficult pen test you've been on? I was talking about this in another podcast earlier today, right? Like, what's the most difficult pen test you've been on? Most of the answers are not because they have the latest and greatest technology, but because they have a team that is all working together as
Mhm.
a really good team would, and much like the Boston Celtics, right? But working together as a team, but also having a really solid process, but also empowering not just the security team, but all people involved in the organization in technology can identify things, can communicate, right? Those are
Mhm.
the most difficult organizations to gain a foothold in and penetrate because they're constantly observing, and everyone's kind of empowered, as security is part of their jobs, to identify stuff, to report stuff, to look at the like systems and processes and go, something's not right, something's not the way it should be, right? And
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
not just a security security outcome. It's a observability point that I was just talking to someone does a lot of OT stuff, and they're like, the monitoring they do, they don't realize that it has a security benefit, but the monitoring they do is also for security. If a conveyor belt is going too slow or too fast, that's something they're monitoring. And if it's an external threat actor that's impacting that, they're going to find that because they know the conveyor belt should be running at this particular speed to put the goods or whatever into the manufacturing
Mm.
process in an OT
Or
environment.
or the centrifuge.
Or the center, and I was exactly what I was thinking of Stuxnet, right? Is they
Mhm.
did detect anomalies. They just couldn't like make those jumps and leaps into there's an external threat actor in our systems. And I think the best organizations at security have a lot of that communication and processes and teamwork in place to be able to identify that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Paul, because quick story. A couple weeks ago, I went back to my alma mater. They were doing a cybersecurity summer camp for high school students, and they invited me up to speak. And I went up to campus, spent the night, and was walking around, reminiscing and stuff. And one of the things I noticed was, when I was there many years ago in the 1900s, the campus security force was like 2 people. uh, Now today they have, I don't know how many people they have employed, but they've got, vehicles that they're driving around, marked vehicles, but they don't call them security officers anymore. They call them safety officers. and I
Yes.
and I talked a little bit to the students at the camp about, think about what the difference is between security and safety. Just the name, just the term. What do you think about when you think about security versus safety? And especially in OT environments, what
Mm.
you're describing, first and foremost is for safety. You want to keep things running and
Yeah.
not blow things
Exactly
up
what
and
I
stuff
talked
like
about
that.
today with
Yep.
our guest on. It was on Below the Surface, right? And it was a manufacturing of hard containers, right? In packaging material, but not
Right.
like cardboard. More like if you're the company that makes Raid, like the spray for bugs, you're
Right.
Mhm.
really good at the chemistry behind your thing, but you need something to hold that and spray it, right? And that was this company.
Right.
And they're
Uh-huh.
like, everyone that comes in an organization, whether you're a guest, to your point, gets a safety briefing, and security has been incorporated into that, making it very difficult. I mean, of course, there's always outliers where someone could breach the physical security, but for the most part, like, you're not just waltzing onto the facility and getting into areas you shouldn't be, because everyone's got to get a safety briefing, and safety is super important. And monitoring and managing the perimeter and who has access is part of safety, and also an extension part of security. And there's a great relationship between the two.
You heard it first on Paul's Safety Weekly, episode
Paul's
1.
That's right. Wear your hard hat.
Nice.
Well, I think we should wrap this segment and delve into the news. There's a definitely some news stories that I'm super excited about, and I have a lot of thoughts to share on certain stories. Hopefully we can bring in some of our other hosts as well. I think Josh is going to stick around. I'm not sure about Adrian.
Yeah.
But let's do that. Let's take a short break and come back with the stories for this week. Stay tuned.